The 13th of July, 2008. A small and newly established U.S. outpost in the remote Afghan province of Nuristan was being manned by American paratroopers and Afghan soldiers. To the men on duty, the day seemed no different from the dozens of other tense, watchful days spent in the unforgiving mountains of eastern Afghanistan. But beneath the surface, something dangerous was stirring. What happened next would become one of the deadliest battles of the entire war, a desperate fight for survival that would test the courage, endurance, and will of the soldiers trapped in a tiny, vulnerable position against an overwhelming force. It was the Battle of Wanat, a 4-hour clash that left 9 Americans dead, 27 wounded, and many questions that haunt military commanders and historians to this day. Welcome to today's documentary. In this video, we'll explore the infamous Battle of Wanat in detail, looking at the events that led to it, the brutal combat that unfolded, and the aftermath that still sparks debate about U.S. strategy in Afghanistan.
Welcome to Matter of Time, your destination for real, unique, and eye-opening stories. From hidden truths to fascinating events, we bring you content that informs, inspires, and keeps you hooked. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments, because every story is better when we experience it together.
The story of Wanat begins not on the day of the ambush, but in the weeks leading up to it. In July 2008, American forces in Nuristan were in the process of shifting their positions. The area was one of the most volatile in Afghanistan, a rugged frontier region bordering Pakistan, with steep valleys that provided perfect cover for insurgent fighters moving back and forth across the border. One of the key American positions in the region was Forward Operating Base Bella, but the military had decided to abandon Bella and relocate its troops to a new patrol base near the village of Wanat, only a few miles away. The purpose of this new base was simple: cut off Taliban supply routes, monitor movement across the valley, and maintain pressure on insurgents who had long dominated the region. The site chosen for the new outpost, officially called Vehicle Patrol Base Kalar, but often simply referred to as Wanat, was strategically important. From there, U.S. forces could oversee the Waghel Valley, one of the most notorious insurgent strongholds in Afghanistan. But it was also dangerously exposed. The base sat in a flat field on the edge of the village, surrounded by high-ground, agricultural terraces and stone buildings that could serve as cover for attackers. Construction began on July 8th, just 5 days before the ambush. The men of 2nd Platoon, Chosen Company 173 Airborne Brigade Combat Team arrived at the site along with a detachment of Afghan National Army troops. They brought with them 5 armored Humvees, several heavy weapons, and the determination to turn the patch of farmland into a defensible strongpoint. But almost from the beginning, things went wrong. A critical piece of construction equipment, a Bobcat loader needed to place heavy barriers, broke down. That meant the protective walls around the base were far lower than planned, leaving large sections dangerously exposed. Instead of 7-foot-high barricades, much of the perimeter had walls barely 4 feet tall. Trenches had to be dug by hand, and barbed wire was strung loosely across open ground that provided little real defense. The men worked tirelessly to improve their defenses, but they knew the truth: the base was far from ready, and the Taliban were watching. Over the days leading up to July 13, soldiers noticed increasing signs of enemy activity. Groups of armed men could be seen in the hills. Villagers moved strangely, sometimes avoiding the Americans altogether. other times making gestures from a distance that suggested coordination. At night, movement in the mountains suggested fighters were gathering. The warning signs were there, but in the grind of Afghanistan, such signs were almost constant. What no one realized was that a massive enemy force was assembling. Estimates vary, but between 200 and 500 Taliban and foreign fighters were preparing a coordinated assault on the under-construction outpost. Their plan was simple: overwhelm the Americans before they can fully establish their base, inflict maximum casualties, and send a message that U.S. forces were not welcome in the Waghal Valley. The stage was set. The Americans and their Afghan allies, just over 70 men in total, were about to face one of the most ferocious assaults of the war. The Battle of Wanat was about to begin.
Section 2. The Ambush and First Contact. It was just before dawn on July 13, 2008, when the storm finally broke. At around 4:20 in the morning, while most of the soldiers were still half awake, the Taliban launched their attack. They had prepared meticulously. Under the cover of night, insurgents had flooded irrigation canals in the fields near the base, letting the running water mask the sound of their movement. Then, as the sky began to lighten, hundreds of fighters crept into position, surrounding the outpost on multiple sides. The Americans had barely begun their day when the first shots rang out. Almost instantly, the base erupted into chaos. Taliban machine guns and rocket-propelled grenades, RPGs, tore through the thin defenses. Mortar rounds exploded inside the compound, sending shrapnel flying in every direction. From the village of Wanat itself, insurgents opened fire from rooftops, windows, and alleyways. Others fired down from the hills, giving them a deadly vantage point over the exposed American position. The first targets were the heavy weapons. Within minutes, the Taliban managed to destroy the Americans' 120mm mortar, a weapon that could have turned the tide of the battle by dropping explosive rounds into enemy positions. With a direct hit, the mortar tube was knocked out of action, and its stockpile of ammunition detonated in a massive fireball. Next, insurgents focused their fire on the Humvees parked inside the base. A rocket slammed into one vehicle, destroying a Tau anti-tank missile system, one of the most powerful weapons available to the defenders. Another Humvee was disabled before its .50 caliber machine gun could even be brought to bear. In just the first few minutes, the Americans had lost two of their heaviest assets, and their defenses were rapidly crumbling. Then the Taliban turned their attention to a small but critical position, the observation post, nicknamed Topside, which sat slightly apart from the main base. This outpost was manned by Sergeant Ryan M. Pitts and 8 other soldiers. From their elevated vantage point, they could watch the approaches to the base and provide covering fire, but it also made them the Taliban's first major target. What happened next would become one of the most harrowing stories of the entire battle. As the sun crept over the mountains, wave after wave of RPGs and machine gun fire slammed into the observation post. Within minutes, every soldier there was either dead or wounded. RPG blasts tore through the sandbags, spraying hot metal fragments across the cramped fighting position. Bullets zipped overhead, and the men had almost nowhere to hide. Corporal Matthew Phillips was killed in the first barrage. Specialist Tyler Stafford was hurled from his position by the force of an explosion. Others were hit by shrapnel or gunfire as they scrambled to return fire. Corporal Jason Bogar, Corporal Jonathan Ayers, and several others fought desperately to hold back the insurgents, but one by one, they were struck down. Amid the carnage, Sergeant Ryan Pitts, himself gravely wounded by shrapnel in his legs and arms, realized he was the last effective man at the observation post. Bleeding heavily and barely able to move, Pitts continued to fight on alone. Crawling between his fallen comrades, he lobbed grenades, fired bursts from his rifle, and radioed frantic messages back to the main base, warning that the position was about to be overrun. His situation was dire. If the Taliban captured the observation post, they could pour fire directly into the main base from above, and the Americans inside would be finished. Meanwhile, back inside the main compound, the rest of the platoon was locked in a desperate struggle of its own. Taliban fighters closed to within just a few dozen meters, firing from every direction. Dozens of enemy combatants poured fire from the stone buildings of Wanat village. Others shot from behind trees and terraces in the fields. The Americans scrambled to man their positions, dragging wounded comrades to cover, returning fire with rifles, machine guns, and grenade launchers. Communications crackled with calls for air support, artillery, and reinforcements. But in those first 30 minutes, it felt like survival was far from guaranteed. The sheer volume of enemy fire was staggering. Soldiers reported that RPG rounds were hitting the base every 15 seconds. Bullets rained down constantly, splintering wood, tearing through sandbags, and ricocheting off metal. The Americans fired back relentlessly, but they were outnumbered at least 4-1, and their defensive works were thin at best. As the minutes turned into an hour, the battlefield became a nightmare of smoke, dust, blood, and confusion. The Taliban pressed closer, at times breaching the wire and slipping into the outer edges of the compound. Hand grenades and claymores were used at point-blank range to keep them out. And still, Sergeant Ryan Pitts held on alone at the observation post. Bleeding, half-conscious, and with the bodies of his comrades around him, he refused to give up. Over the radio, he warned the platoon commander, "They're inside the wire. If you don't get reinforcements up here, we're done." The Americans were on the brink of collapse, but help, at least in the form of supporting fire, was finally on its way.
Section 3. Air Support, the Fight for Survival, and the Turning Point. By the time the sun was fully up, the Americans at Wanat were locked in a fight for their lives. The Taliban had attacked with overwhelming numbers, an estimated 200 fighters, though some reports later suggested as many as 400. From nearly every direction, gunfire and RPGs poured down on the exposed base. Inside the wire, the defenders scrambled desperately to stay alive. Every man was engaged, whether firing back at the enemy, dragging the wounded to makeshift aid stations, or sprinting across open ground under fire to resupply ammunition. The small medical tent was quickly overwhelmed as casualties mounted. Blood soaked into the dirt floor as medics worked frantically, often under fire themselves. The situation was so desperate that soldiers began to use claymore mines, normally placed in advance to cover approaches, to repel Taliban fighters who were slipping into the outer edges of the compound. Detonating them at close range shredded attackers, but also underscored just how close the enemy had come to breaching the defenses. Meanwhile, Sergeant Ryan Pitts was still clinging to life at the observation post. Alone and gravely wounded, he kept up a steady stream of grenades and rifle fire to hold off the Taliban from overrunning his position completely. His voice on the radio was faint and ragged, but he continued to call in updates and warnings. At one point, he told headquarters he didn't think he was going to survive, but insisted they had to keep fighting for the base. Finally, after nearly an hour of unrelenting combat, the Americans were able to bring in outside firepower. Air support came instantly from Camp Blessing. Artillery crews began pounding the Taliban positions with 155mm shells. Nearly 100 rounds slammed into the fields and terraces around Wanat, forcing some insurgents to take cover. The thunder of the artillery shook the valley, but it wasn't enough to stop the determined assault. Within minutes, more support arrived from the skies. An MQ-1 Predator drone unleashed Hellfire missiles onto enemy positions. Soon after, AH-64 Apache helicopters swooped into the valley, spitting 30mm chain gun fire into clusters of insurgents. The gunships targeted muzzle flashes, RPG teams, and groups of fighters darting between buildings. But even with American air power hammering them, the Taliban did not break. They were experienced fighters, many of them locals who knew the terrain intimately. They shifted positions constantly, using the cover of stone walls, tree lines, and irrigation ditches to avoid destruction. And with sheer numbers on their side, they kept the pressure on the outpost. For the men inside the base, the battle became a cycle of survival. Fire a burst, duck as RPG slammed into the sandbags, drag a wounded comrade out of the kill zone, run low on ammunition, then sprint across open ground to get more. At times, soldiers were forced to expose themselves completely, crossing areas swept by gunfire just to keep their positions supplied. Several men were killed or wounded in these desperate dashes. One soldier recalled later that the incoming fire was so constant and intense that it felt like the entire valley was erupting at once, as if every weapon in Afghanistan was pointed right at us. The Taliban used clever tricks to keep the pressure up. Fighters would throw rocks over the walls of the American compound, mimicking the sound of grenades hitting the dirt. In the chaos of combat, soldiers often couldn't tell the difference. Fearing explosions, they'd bolt from cover, only to run straight into waiting gunfire. In the observation post, Ryan Pitts continued his lonely fight. Barely conscious from blood loss, he could hear Taliban fighters closing in just feet away. Crawling through the dirt, he hurled grenades until his supply was nearly gone. Then he switched to his M4 carbine, firing short bursts to keep the enemy at bay. Each minute he held out brought precious time for the rest of the platoon. At last, reinforcements from the main base were able to reach him, fighting their way up to the observation post and evacuating the surviving wounded. Pitts, though barely alive, was pulled back into the compound, still clutching his weapon. His refusal to surrender that position was later credited with preventing the Taliban from overrunning the entire outpost. As the battle dragged into its third and fourth hours, more American air power rained down. Air Force A-10 Warthogs swooped in, strafing Taliban fighters with their fearsome GAU-8 Avenger cannon. A B-1B Lancer bomber released heavy ordnance onto insurgent positions in the surrounding mountains. F-15E Strike Eagles joined the fray, unleashing precision-guided bombs that shook the valley floor. The sheer weight of American air power finally began to tip the scales. Taliban fighters who had pressed close to the wire were forced to retreat or risk being annihilated from above. Those still firing from the village and fields started to scatter as bombs cratered their positions. After nearly 4 hours of unrelenting combat, the attack finally began to falter. The Taliban had thrown everything they had at Wanat, but the defenders, though bloodied and battered, were still standing. Smoke drifted over the shattered outpost. Fires burned where vehicles had been destroyed. The ground was littered with spent shell casings, blood-soaked bandages, and shattered equipment. The men of 2nd Platoon were exhausted, their ears ringing from the constant explosions, their throats raw from smoke and dust. But they had survived. The cost, however, was devastating. Section 4. Aftermath and Legacy. When the guns finally fell silent at Wanat, the valley was eerily quiet. Smoke drifted over the shattered outpost, and the exhausted survivors began to count their dead. 9 American soldiers had been killed, and 27 more wounded, one of the heaviest losses of any single battle during the war in Afghanistan. The Taliban, too, had suffered heavily. Estimates of their casualties ranged from dozens to well over 100. But for the men of 2nd Platoon, victory felt hollow. They had survived, but at a staggering cost. In the years that followed, the Battle of Wanat became one of the most scrutinized engagements of the Afghan War. Investigations questioned why the outpost was built in such a vulnerable position, why intelligence had missed signs of the coming attack, and whether the soldiers had been asked to accomplish the impossible. Amid the controversy, one story stood out: the courage of Sergeant Ryan Pitts. Gravely wounded, yet refusing to yield, his defense of the observation post was credited with preventing the entire base from being overrun. For his actions, Pitts was awarded the Medal of Honor, a recognition not just of his bravery, but of the sacrifice and resilience of every man who fought that day. The Battle of Wanat remains a grim reminder of the unforgiving nature of modern war. Outnumbered and surrounded, the Americans had faced annihilation, but through courage, grit, and the will to stand by one another, they endured. And though the valley of Wanat has long since fallen silent, the memory of those who fought and died there continues to echo, etched into the history of a war defined by sacrifice.